Whispers of a Vanished Empire, it begins with a whisper. Not the booming declarations of kings or the ringing proclamations of empires, but a faint murmur carried across centuries, across pages yellowed with time, across maps inked by hands that struggled to make sense of the vast unknown. Somewhere beyond the familiar frontiers of Europe and the Middle East, past the deserts of Persia, past the mountains of Central Asia, travellers once told of a place they called Tartaria. For most of us today, the name sounds strange, even foreign, like a mispronounced echo of something more familiar. We might think of Tartars, the broad label once given by Europeans to steppe peoples, or of the Mongol horde galloping westward under Genghis Khan's banner. Yet Tartaria is something different, at least in the way it appears on maps and in scattered accounts. It was not simply Mongolia, nor Russia, nor China. It was everything in between and somehow more. A land without clear borders, a country without a king, an empire that seemed too vast, too amorphous to be real. The first thing we notice when peering into this phantom empire is how it refuses to stay in place. One map might show Tartaria sprawling across all of Siberia, stretching from the Urals to the Pacific, swallowing Mongolia whole, and even brushing the edges of China and Persia. Another might shrink it to a few northern provinces, little more than a vague placeholder for lands unexplored. A cartographer in Amsterdam in the 17th century would colour in Great Tartary as though it were a monolith. An English mapmaker a century later would slice it into Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Little Tartary, as though cartography itself were trying to domesticate the wildness of the word. And this is where the whisper becomes a riddle. If Tartaria was never a nation in the modern sense, never a centralised state with borders, armies, or archives, why did it appear again and again on the maps of learned Europeans? Why did scholars, traders, and missionaries write of it as though it were a coherent realm? Why did the name persist for centuries before fading from the record almost entirely by the 19th century? Scholars still debate whether the label reflected genuine geopolitical reality or whether it was merely a cartographic convenience, a way for Europeans to cover their ignorance with the illusion of knowledge. Yet within that uncertainty lies the spark that has ignited modern imaginations. For some, Tartaria is not simply a label, but a lost empire, erased from history by deliberate design. Its remnants, they say, survive in architecture too advanced for its time, in technology hidden in plain sight, in the uncanny resemblance of distant cultures. Could it be, as fringe theorists whisper, that Tartaria was history's greatest cover-up? Or is the story of Tartaria simply one more example of how fragile our maps of the past truly are? We begin, then, not with certainty, but with possibility. Imagine standing in a candlelit study in Amsterdam in the year 1680. Before you lies a world map, the ink still fresh, the parchment stretched taut. Europe is crisply defined, Africa outlined with jagged precision, the Americas roughly but confidently sketched. And then, to the north of Persia, beyond the Caspian, an ocean of land sprawls into the margins of the page. Across that blankness, one word unfurls like a banner: Tartaria. No capital is marked, no boundary fixed. It is less a country than a question mark drawn in ink, and perhaps that is where the power of Tartaria still lies, not in what we know about it, but in what we don't. Cartographers and phantom kingdoms. If Section 1 was a whisper, then maps were the echo chamber that made it linger. For centuries, cartographers were the storytellers of geography, their vellum and parchment crowded with mountains, rivers, monsters, and borders drawn sometimes from fact, sometimes from rumour. And among the most persistent of these recurring inventions was Tartaria, an empire that stretched across the heart of Eurasia, sprawling so vast that it defied imagination. The earliest maps to carry the name Tartary were not careful delineations but sweeping gestures, as if map-makers, confronted with an ocean of unknown territory, reached for the broadest possible brushstroke. In a 16th century atlas, one might see Tartaria enveloping all of Siberia, reaching to the frozen Arctic seas, spilling south toward Persia, and rubbing against the walls of China. On others, it appeared subdivided: Great Tartary, covering Siberia; Chinese Tartary, marking Manchuria; Independent Tartary, dotting Central Asia; Little Tartary, tucked along the Black Sea coast. To the European eye, these distinctions gave a sense of order, but to us, centuries later, they reveal uncertainty masquerading as precision. And yet, maps were not simply guesses, they were also statements of authority, declarations of what the known world was meant to look like. When Tartaria appeared in heavy Gothic script across half a continent, it became real not because it existed as an empire, but because people came to believe that it did. Scholars still debate whether this persistence reflects European ignorance of Asia's complexities, or whether something larger, an alternative political identity, or even a federation of peoples, once justified the term. Consider a striking example. In the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, often hailed as the first modern atlas, compiled by Abraham Ortelius in 1570, the word Tart, Aria, sprawls boldly across northern Asia. Here it occupies space not merely as geography but as symbol. Much as medieval maps placed fantastical beasts in uncharted seas, Ortelius chose to anchor Eurasia's mystery in the notion of Tartary. This phantom empire provided a narrative, a way to impose order on the chaos of the unknown. And therein lies the strangeness. For some, Tartaria was not only a label, but also a reflection of long-standing cultural encounters. The Mongols, after all, had thundered across Asia and Europe in the 13th century, leaving behind both terror and fascination. Europeans, recalling the word Tartar, extended it into Tartar, and from there, Tartary. Yet there was a slippage. By the 17th century, cartographers were not simply referring to Mongols, but to an entire landmass, a continent within a continent, that bore little resemblance to actual steppe polities. The quirky detail here lies in how flexible those names became. There was even a Tartaria Magna, Great Tartary, which some maps suggested was larger than the whole of Europe combined. Others included Tartaria Deserta, a deserted Tartary, suggesting vast lands too barren or too frightening to even populate with speculation. In this way, Tartaria became a catch-all, a phantom kingdom, sprawling wherever knowledge faltered. Mainstream history tells us that as geographic exploration advanced, especially with Russian expansion into Siberia from the 16th to 18th centuries, the map of Tartaria shrank. Slowly, Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, and Manchuria became distinct regions with their own names. By the mid-19th century, most serious atlases had erased Tartaria altogether, replacing its vagueness with detail. But the ghost of Tartaria remained in the margins. Old books, schoolroom globes, and scattered maps still bore its name. Scholars still debate whether this erasure was natural, simply the byproduct of progress, or whether it represented a deliberate rewriting of geography, a decision to fold a mysterious placeholder into neat national narratives. After all, the story of maps is also the story of power. Whoever names the land shapes its history. Imagine a traveller in the year 1700, tracing his finger along a map in a London shop. He sees China neatly inscribed, Persia in bold, the Ottoman Empire stretching wide, and then, across the north, the word Tartaria, like a curtain drawn across the unknown. What lay behind that curtain, he could not say. And perhaps that is why Tartaria has continued to enchant us, because maps, those guardians of certainty, once gave space to mystery. Marco Polo's echoes. When we turn from the ink of cartographers to the words of travellers, one name rises above all: Marco Polo. His travels, written in the late 13th century, carried Europe's imagination deep into Asia for the first time. Through his eyes, readers glimpsed deserts of unending sand, cities brimming with silk and jewels, and courts filled with wealth so dazzling that Europe's kings scarcely believed him. And yet, in his descriptions lies one of the earliest threads woven into the fabric of Tartaria. Marco Polo's journey, beginning in Venice around 1271, carried him across the Silk Road into the vast dominion of Kublai Khan. His accounts of Cathay, what we now know as China, were revolutionary, offering Europeans details of gunpowder, paper money, and postal systems. But scattered across his narrative are also references to the northern and western territories, lands Polo called Tartary. He described them as immense, wild, and sometimes hostile, home to nomadic tribes, great khans, and mysterious cities that seem to flicker between history and legend. One striking account tells of the great steppe beyond the Oxus River, where Polo encountered people he called Tartars. He painted them as fierce horsemen, eating raw meat softened under their saddles, loyal to no one but their clan. To Polo, their lands seemed endless, stretching beyond comprehension. This, in essence, was the Europe of his readers, a vision of the East as an almost supernatural expanse of power and mystery. Mainstream historians today acknowledge that Marco Polo was describing Mongol dominions, particularly under Kublai Khan, whose empire stretched across Eurasia. Yet here lies the subtle twist. When his stories were retold and translated in Europe, the distinctions blurred. The Mongols became Tartars, and their empire, however vast, fused in the European imagination into a place Alad Tartary. It was not a precise translation, but a conflation, a single word that absorbed tribes, kingdoms, and landscapes into one imagined empire. Here we encounter the quirky detail. Some medieval manuscripts of Polo's travels even include curious embellishments that he never wrote. In one version, fantastical creatures stalk the margins of Tartary, men with dogs' heads, giant birds of prey, cities of gold. Polo himself was cautious in many of his claims, but European scribes and storytellers, hungry for marvels, embroidered his narrative until fact and fantasy became indistinguishable. The result was that Tartary became as much a stage for wonder as for geography. Scholars still debate whether Marco Polo ever truly visited all the places he described. Some insist that his details of China are too precise to be fabricated, while others argue that he may have borrowed stories from Persian or Chinese sources. What is certain, however, is that his words gave Tartary its first enduring echo in Western consciousness. By his pen, Europe came to imagine the northern heartlands of Asia not just as deserts and mountains, but as a realm of khans, warriors, and hidden splendours. Picture the scene, a candlelit chamber in Venice, around the year 1300. A copyist reads aloud from Polo's manuscript. Nobles and merchants lean forward as he recounts the wealth of the East, the armies of horsemen, the dazzling palaces of Kublai Khan. The listeners are spellbound, not merely by the riches, but by the vastness. This place called Tartary, a land so wide it could swallow kingdoms whole. They would never see it, but in their imaginations it was real, as tangible as Rome or Paris. And so the echo of Marco Polo lingers. Long after the Mongol Empire fractured, long after Polo's bones lay buried in Venetian soil, his words carried forward a vision of Asia that blurred lines between truth and tale. Tartaria, as a concept, began to take root not because it was clearly defined, but because it was wondrously undefined. An empire large enough to house the dreams and fears of an entire continent, the Mongol conquest's shadow. If Marco Polo gave Europe its first vivid impressions of Tartary, the Mongols gave it weight. For in the 13th century the world trembled beneath the thunder of hooves that seemed to roll from horizon to horizon. The Mongol conquests were not simply wars, they were an upheaval that reshaped Eurasia. From the Pacific to the Danube, from Persia to the steppes of Russia, Genghis Khan and his descendants carved an empire so vast it remains one of the largest in history. And in their wake, Europeans began to fuse Mongol power with the shadowy idea of Tartaria. The Mongol Empire, at its height, stretched over 33 million square kilometres, an expanse unmatched until the British Empire 6 centuries later. It was not merely size that stunned contemporaries, but speed. Armies of horse archers, disciplined and ruthless, swept across kingdoms with frightening efficiency. Towns that resisted were obliterated. Those that submitted were incorporated into an empire that prized loyalty and tribute above all else. Cities like Baghdad fell, leaving cultural wounds that echo to this day. To European chroniclers, the conquerors were Tartars. The word itself is revealing. Derived from Tatars, a Turkic-speaking people of the steppe, it morphed in European mouths into Tartars, evoking the Latin Tartarus, the underworld of Greek myth. To call them Tartars was to paint them as demons riding out of hell. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in the 1240s, culminating in the sack of Kiev and the burning of cities in Poland and Hungary, seared the name into European memory. Tartary became synonymous not only with distance, but with terror. Yet, within this shadow, other impressions emerged. Chroniclers marvelled at Mongol organisation, their postal relay system, their census-taking, their networks of spies and scouts. The empire was both destruction and sophistica, Tian barbarity and efficiency. And because Europeans lacked finer distinctions between Mongol Khanates, Turkic tribes, and Siberian peoples, the vast political landscape north of Persia became a single, amorphous entity, Tartaria. A quirky detail illustrates this blurring. In some Renaissance maps, Tartaria appears alongside notations like Empire of the Great Cham, a garbled reference to the Khan. Here, cartographers combined myth, hearsay, and fragments of truth, turning a diverse political reality into a singular realm ruled by a near-mythical sovereign. In fact, some 16th century European writers imagined the Great Khan of Tartary as a rival to the Pope himself, a heathen monarch with power equal to Rome's spiritual throne. Mainstream historians, of course, describe a different reality. After the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire fractured into Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These polities often feuded, their unity more fragile than maps suggested. But to outsiders, the distinctions mattered little. To a European merchant in Genoa or a monk in Paris, the entire northern expanse could be called nothing else but Tartary. Scholars still debate whether Europeans truly misunderstood the Mongol Empire, or whether Tartary functioned as a kind of shorthand, a word that made sense of complexity for audiences far removed from Asia. Was it ignorance, or was it simply the language of distance, where names blur and details fade? Imagine the shadow cast by those conquests. In 1241, as Mongol armies reached the plains of Hungary, Europe braced for annihilation. Chroniclers recorded prayers rising in cathedrals, kings trembling at the thought of horsemen sweeping westward. And then, as suddenly as they had come, the armies withdrew after the death of the great Khan in Mongolia. To those who survived, the spectre remained. Somewhere beyond the Carpathians, beyond the endless steppe, lay Tartary, a land of horsemen who could, at any moment, return. It is here, in the lingering fear of the Mongols, that Tartaria began to harden into myth. It was not merely a place, it was a warning, a phantom empire that embodied both the memory of devastation and the possibility of marvel. and its shadow stretched far beyond the 13th century, colouring maps, chronicles and imaginations for centuries to come. Great cities on the steppe. For many, the steppe conjures a vision of emptiness, a sea of grass stretching to the horizon, windswept, barren and lonely. But history insists the picture was never so simple. Scattered across those plains, tucked along rivers and trade routes, were cities, some real, some half-remembered, and some perhaps imagined, that gave rise to whispers of greatness. To those who spoke of Tartaria, these cities became signposts of an empire lost to time. Mainstream history acknowledges several powerful urban centres across Central Asia and the Eurasian steppe. Karakoram, for instance, founded by Genghis Khan around 1220, rose as the political heart of the Mongol Empire. Though modest in size compared to Baghdad or Constantinople, it boasted palaces, temples, and markets where goods from China mingled with treasures of the Middle East. Travellers described silver trees with mechanical branches in the palace court, pouring wine and fermented mare's milk from sculpted spouts, symbols of a cosmopolitan culture at odds with Europe's image of barbarian horsemen. Further south, Samarkand flourished as a jewel of the Silk Road, though technically outside the northern Tartary label. In the 14th century, under Timur, known in the west as Tamerlane, it became a city of glittering mosques and tiled domes, where Persian artisans and Indian builders reshaped the skyline. To European eyes, it was a mirage, proof that splendour could rise from the dust of the steppe. Yet for Tartaria's lore, it is the forgotten or rumoured cities that matter most. Stories circulate of towns swallowed by sandstorms, of fortresses abandoned overnight, of capitals built by unknown architects and lost without a trace. One curious example appears in early modern travellers' tales, the city of Sibir near the Irtysh River, which gave its name to Siberia. Though later incorporated into Russian dominion, in some accounts it appears as the capital of a Tartarian Khanate, a city of power whose memory flickers faintly in chronicles. And then there are the quirky, almost fantastical details. In the 16th and 17th centuries, some European maps placed names like Cathay City or Zandu, a distortion of Shangdu, Kublai Khan's summer capital, in vague northern territories, blurring them into the realm of Tartaria. Samuel Purchas, an English writer of travel literature, once claimed that Tartary held palaces more wondrous than any in Europe, built by hands now lost to record. Such tales, whether true or embroidered, fueled the notion that Tartaria had once been home to cities whose sophistication rivaled Rome or Byzantium. Scholars still debate whether these stories reflect genuine forgotten settlements, mistranslations of Chinese or Persian texts, or pure invention. The Eurasian steppe is littered with archaeological ruins, forts, caravanserais, and walled towns that hint at thriving societies, yet few match the scale of grandeur that legend assigns to Tartaria. Could there have been cities swallowed by the earth, erased by conquest, or buried beneath mud and flood, as later fringe theories would suggest? Or are we witnessing the human tendency to magnify fragments of memory into entire civilizations? Imagine the scene through the eyes of a 17th century merchant riding along the caravan routes of Central Asia. After weeks of endless steppe, the silhouette of walls rises on the horizon, domes glimmer in the fading sun, and minarets stretch toward the sky. To him, this is Tartary, not a wasteland, but a land where wonder lurks beyond the grass. When he returns home and tells of these places, listeners envision an empire dotted with glittering cities, hidden beyond Europe's gaze. The image of Tartaria as a realm of lost capitals persists even now. Conspiracy enthusiasts point to photographs of 19th century Russian cities, ornate, domed, impossibly grand, and ask whether they are remnants of Tartarian architecture repurposed by new rulers. They imagine Karakoram not as a vanished Mongol seat, but as one fragment of a forgotten network of advanced cities that once spanned Eurasia. Whether fact or fantasy, these cities gave Tartaria its soul. An empire is not merely defined by armies or maps, but by the vision of great centres, places where culture, trade and power converge. And in the shifting sands of history, Tartaria's cities remain half-seen, like mirages shimmering on the horizon, forever tempting us with the possibility that something extraordinary once stood upon the steppe. Architecture that shouldn't exist. If cities were the bones of Tartaria, then architecture was its skin, gleaming, improbable, and enduring in ways that fuel debate even today. Across Eurasia, from the banks of the Volga to the deserts of Central Asia, stand structures that seem oddly out of place, domes too ornate for their setting, towers echoing distant traditions, and buildings whose origins blur into obscurity. For mainstream historians, these are the natural byproducts of empires colliding along trade routes. For others, they are whispers of a civilization deliberately erased, the architectural fingerprints of Tartaria. One example often cited is the Kazan Kremlin in Russia, a fortress complex with a blend of Islamic and Russian styles. Its Kol Sharif mosque, reconstructed in modern times, recalls the grandeur of earlier Islamic architecture on the steppe. Another is the Astrakhan Kremlin, whose sharp white walls and towers rise from the flatlands like something transplanted from a Mediterranean coast. Both are accepted as products of the Russian expansion into Tatar lands during the 16th century, yet their mix of styles has led some fringe theorists to claim they are reworked remnants of a vanished empire. More striking still are the ornate wooden churches of Siberia, particularly those on Kizhi Island, crowned with onion domes that glimmer like silver in the sun. Built without nails, their construction is attributed to Russian craftsmen of the 18th century, but skeptics note their eerie resemblance to domed structures thousands of miles away. Could they be the last echoes of an architectural vocabulary inherited from something older, something Tartarian? A quirky detail lurks in the heart of Moscow itself. St. Basil's Cathedral, completed in the 16th century, is usually celebrated as the epitome of Russian Orthodox architecture, yet its flamboyant swirling domes and geometric towers have long puzzled observers. Foreign visitors in the 17th century described it as more like a vision than a building, and conspiracy enthusiasts today sometimes suggest it is not Russian at all, but a repurposed Tartarian temple, its origins disguised by new narratives. Mainstream scholars point instead to cultural blending, Byzantine influence, Islamic motifs from conquered Tatar lands, and local Russian traditions merging in the crucible of empire. And yet, scholars still debate whether certain design elements, intricate geometries, structural techniques, even the engineering of domes, may have travelled across Eurasia through channels we scarcely understand. Was knowledge shared through artisans migrating along the Silk Road? Or were these convergences signs of a deeper, older tradition that once spanned the steppe? Consider also the canals and fortifications of Central Asia. In Bukhara and Khiva, elaborate systems of water management sustained cities in desert climates. Officially, they are legacies of Islamic khanates. Yet their sophistication, kilometres of underground channels, aqueducts that mirrored Roman efficiency, has led some to wonder if they, too, reflect older knowledge. Some fringe claims even link them to the so-called Tartarian mud floods, catastrophes that allegedly buried entire cities, leaving only the upper stories visible today. Imagine standing in Omsk or Irkutsk in the 19th century, where photographs show neoclassical facades and elaborate administrative buildings rising in what were once frontier towns. To the modern eye, they appear out of proportion, too ornate for their context. Conspiracy theorists argue these were not new constructions, but appropriated Tartarian remnants, their true origins erased by Russian imperial expansion. Historians counter that empire often built lavishly on its margins, projecting grandeur too. O cement authority. Yet the tension remains. Why do some frontier cities seem to boast architecture rivaling capitals far older and wealthier? This, ultimately, is the paradox of Tartarian architecture. On one hand, we see clear patterns of cultural exchange. Russian domes influenced by Tatars, Islamic arches shaped by Persians, Silk Road towns enriched by China and India. On the other, we find buildings that feel dislocated, out of sync with their time and place, and in those dislocations, the story of Tartaria gains strength. Was it truly an empire erased, its cities repurposed, its architecture disguised beneath new coats of paint? Or are we simply projecting mysteries onto the normal blending of cultures that always occurs at crossroads of empire? Scholars still debate whether these anomalies are meaningful clues or illusions born of our desire for hidden histories. And yet, as we gaze at onion domes glinting against the Siberian sky, at fortress walls standing solitary in endless steppe, at towers whose origins no one can quite agree upon, we cannot help but feel the tug of possibility, that somewhere, somehow, Tartaria left its mark not only in maps and myths, but in stone and timber, rising stubbornly against the winds of time. The clockwork of empire. What makes an empire endure? For Rome, it was roads and legions. For China, dynasties and bureaucracy. For the Mongols, mobility and fear. But in the strange case of Tartaria, whispers suggest something more. An infrastructure not only of conquest but of marvels. To some, Tartaria was not merely a realm of horsemen and domes, it was a civilization of clockwork precision, harnessing technologies that seemed to leap ahead of their time. Mainstream accounts describe the Mongol Empire's celebrated communication network, the Yam, a relay system of horses and stations stretching thousands of miles across Eurasia. Riders could carry messages from Beijing to the Black Sea faster than nearly any rival civilization could dream. Marco Polo himself marveled at it, likening the stations to a string of pearls laid across the land. For scholars, this system represented the skeleton of empire, a marvel of logistics that allowed control across such staggering distances. But layered atop this truth are the myths. Fringe stories claim Tartaria possessed canals and energy systems more advanced than Europe of the same era. Some point to ancient channels in Central Asia, such as the vast Qanat systems of Persia adapted across the steppe, as proof of hydrological mastery. Others speculate that entire steppe cities were aligned like clock gears, their layouts too geometrically precise to be mere chance. A quirky detail emerges in the form of 18th and 19th century star forts. Found not only in Europe but also in remote parts of Russia, Siberia, and even Central Asia, these angular, star-shaped fortifications seem strangely widespread. Mainstream historians explain them as a military fashion spread by European engineers. Yet conspiracy enthusiasts ask, why do so many appear in regions once marked as Tartary? Were they Russian impositions or inherited relics from a foe? Gotten architectural science? In more speculative circles, the marvels grow even stranger. Some suggest Tartaria harnessed free energy, pointing to the ornate spires and domes of old buildings as antennas rather than decoration. Photographs of 19th century expositions in Paris, Chicago, and St. Petersburg show enormous electric lights and machinery, often attributed to modern inventiveness. But for Tartarian enthusiasts, these are not novelties, they are survivals, fragments of a global technology once hidden in plain sight. Mainstream historians naturally remain skeptical. They trace each structure, each canal, each fort to known builders, known technologies, known contexts. And yet, scholars still debate whether we underestimate the technological sophistication of steppe societies. Too often, nomads are dismissed as mere raiders, when in fact they absorbed, transmitted, and adapted technologies across continents. Did the Mongols, for example, not spread gunpowder warfare to Europe? Did they not establish currencies and taxation systems across diverse lands? In this sense, Tartaria, real or imagined, becomes a symbol of innovation as much as conquest. Picture a caravan arriving in a Central Asian city around 1500. At its gates stand walls shaped like intricate stars. Inside, water flows through channels cut deep beneath the earth, cooling homes against desert heat. Overhead, towers gleam with gilded domes. A merchant sees only prosperity, but to modern eyes the scene suggests an empire with the clockwork of organization, design, and technology. Was Tartaria truly an empire of marvels, erased from history? Or do we simply forget how extraordinary even known societies could be when viewed through the haze of centuries? Scholars still debate whether the technologies attributed to Tartaria were truly lost, or whether they simply became invisible, assimilated into the narratives of other empires, renamed and reassigned until their origins dissolved. And so, Tartaria lives on as a paradox, a place where legend insists on canals that rival Rome, energy systems that foreshadow Tesla, fortresses shaped like stars, and a logistical machine that bound half a continent together. Whether these marvels were truly Tartarian or merely echoes of many empires blending into one another, the impression remains an empire that should not have existed and yet perhaps did. Catastrophes and mud floods. Every empire has its fall. Rome collapsed to barbarians, Byzantium to cannons, the Aztecs to conquistadors. But when it comes to Tartaria, the story grows stranger. For if some believe this empire once stretched across the steppes and beyond, others insist its disappearance was not the slow erosion of history, but a catastrophe sudden and unnatural, an event that buried cities, swallowed knowledge, and left only fragments behind. The name given to this mystery, the Mud Flood. Mainstream history recognizes no such disaster on a global scale. Local floods, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions are well attested, but nothing to suggest that entire continents were smothered in mud within the last few centuries. And yet, in fringe circles, photographs and old engravings are marshalled as evidence. Buildings in St. Petersburg, Moscow, even provincial Siberian towns show windows and doors sunk below ground level, as though their lower floors were swallowed by earth. Were these simply the result of rebuilding, of urban design choices, or do they hint at a catastrophe few remember? The idea takes hold because the images are undeniably curious. In photographs from the 19th century, labourers dig streets that reveal doorways buried beneath soil. In other cases, grand civic buildings appear half submerged, their lower arches functioning as basements, though they were once designed as ground floors. Mainstream explanations speak of changing street levels, of reconstruction in growing cities, of centuries of accumulated debris. But for those attuned to the legend of Tartaria, the buried facade suggests something more, that whole cities were drowned in a tidal wave of mud and only their rooftops remained visible. A quirky strand of the theory even connects these mud floods with global resets, cycles in which civilizations rise to greatness only to be ically obliterated by Earth's upheavals. Some enthusiasts point to accounts of floods in Central Asia, or to Siberian legends of lands swallowed by Earth, as folkloric memory of such an event. The myth of Atlantis is sometimes woven into this tapestry, as though Tartaria was but one incarnation of a recurring lost civilization. Mainstream archaeology, of course, pushes back. Excavations in Siberia and Central Asia reveal layers of settlement, destruction, and rebuilding, but nothing suggesting a single apocalyptic flood in recent centuries. Scholars still debate, however, whether certain urban anomalies, sudden desertions, architectural remains without clear historical records, reflect environmental upheavals we have yet to fully understand. After all, climate shifts and floods have undone empires before. Why not here as well? Imagine walking through St. Petersburg in the late 1800s. The city gleams with neoclassical facades, vast squares, canals glistening in northern sunlight. But here and there, something seems off. A building's windows lie almost at street level, half hidden. A grand doorway opens into earth rather than air. Passers-by take no notice, but in the mind of a careful observer, questions stir. Were these structures designed this way, or did something bury them, leaving only the upper stories to witness the modern age? Fringe theorists push the image further still. Entire Tartarian cities swallowed, their spires protruding like bones through mud, their streets entombed beneath layers of soil. Perhaps the catastrophe, they suggest, was global, erasing not just Tartaria, but many civilizations, paving the way for the modern world to rewrite history in its own image. Whether one sees mystery or mundane explanation, the allure is undeniable. Tartaria's vanishing lends itself to catastrophe, to sudden silence rather than slow decay. Scholars may insist on political absorption, on Russian expansion and the fading of a name from maps, but the mud flood idea offers something more dramatic, a reason why an empire could exist so vast and yet leave behind only whispers. Scholars still debate whether the anomalies in architecture and city design truly demand an extraordinary explanation. Yet as we peer at photographs of sunken doors, half-buried arches, and strange layers of stone, we are tempted by the thought, perhaps history is not merely written by the victors, it is buried, sometimes quite literally, beneath our feet, the puzzle of people. No empire can exist without its people, and Tartaria is no exception. Yet when we attempt to identify its inhabitants, the picture becomes a mosaic of confusion, myth, and speculation. Who were the Tartarians? Were they Mongols, Turks, Russians, or some forgotten race entirely? Travelogues, maps, and later photographs offer hints, but the answer slips through our fingers like sand across the steppe. Mainstream accounts suggest that Tartaria was less an empire of one unified people and more a label applied to diverse tribes, confederations, and nomadic societies. The Eurasian steppe was home to Turkic tribes, Mongol clans, and Siberian hunter-gatherers, each with distinct languages, customs, and political structures. Europeans, encountering these societies through traders or soldiers, frequently lumped them together, calling all northern nomads Tartars and their lands Tartary. In this sense, the so-called Tartarians were not a single ethnic group, but a composite identity projected from the outside. Yet the tales told about Tartarians often diverge dramatically from the records we know. Early European sources describe towering warriors with pale eyes and strange dress, living in ornate palaces on the steppe. Others tell of giants, their height measured in spans rather than feet, carrying immense spears and living in walled cities the size of small nations. These reports are often dismissed as exaggeration or folklore, but they persist, a curious echo of a civilization whose memory has been partially erased. A quirky fragment of evidence comes from Siberia, where indigenous Evenki and Yakut oral histories describe people of the mountains or people of the river, tall and pale, with skills in architecture, metalwork, and horsemanship that surpassed local norms. Were these survivors of Tartaria, or are these stories simply ancestral myth, adapted over generations? Scholars still debate whether such accounts contain kernels of truth, cultural memory, or complete fabrication. Some modern Tartaria enthusiasts go further, suggesting that Tartarians were physically distinct, a technologically advanced people intentionally erased by subsequent empires. Photographs of 19th century Russians and Central Asians with unusually grand architecture and symmetrical streets are cited as evidence that remnants of Tartarian society were assimilated rather than destroyed. Critics argue that this interpretation ignores the documented skills of Russian engineers, European-trained architects, and the natural progression of urbanization. Yet the tension remains, and the puzzle of the people persists. Consider the traveller of the 17th century journeying along the Irtysh or Ob rivers. He encounters groups of nomads on horseback, watches them manage herds, build temporary homes, and navigate vast distances with uncanny skill. To him, they are wild, untamed, almost mythical. But to us, centuries later, they are tantalizingly ambiguous. Were these the Tartarians described in legends, or merely the ancestors of tribes whose stories became entwined with the phantom empire? What is undeniable is that the identity of Tartaria's inhabitants is fluid, shifting with context and interpretation. Maps record places, chronicles record rulers, but the people themselves seem to dissolve into a collective myth, simultaneously real and imagined. Scholars still debate whether Tartarians were simply an external label imposed by Europeans, or whether they once constituted a coherent cultural group that the historical record failed to capture. And so we are left with a paradox. An empire that could stretch across continents, yet whose people remain partly hidden, partly legendary. To understand Tartaria is to confront the limits of human memory, the POW, air of myth, and the enduring mystery of a society that may have existed, or at least seemed to exist, just beyond the edge of history. Empire on the edges. The geography of Tartaria, like its people, is elusive. While maps mark its presence, its boundaries shift as if unwilling to be pinned down. From the frozen tundras of Siberia to the rugged Caucasus Mountains, from the vast plains of Kazakhstan to the steppes bordering China, Tartaria's edges seem to dance, expanding and contracting, depending on who drew the map and when. It is an empire defined as much by absence as by presence, a place at the edge of the known world, both geographically and conceptually. Mainstream history shows us that the lands traditionally labelled Tartary were far from empty. The Kazakh steppe, the Altai Mountains, and Siberia were home to thriving communities, nomads, herders, hunters, and traders who navigated a harsh environment with remarkable skill. Russian expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries gradually absorbed these regions, incorporating them into Tsarist administration. By the 19th century, these territories had been fully integrated, and the old label of Tartary began to fade from maps. Yet in its time, Tartaria occupied a liminal space, a frontier that belonged neither fully to one empire nor another. The quirky detail lies in the way Tartaria's boundaries were interpreted by outsiders. European cartographers often extended its borders to fill empty space, colouring vast swathes of land with the same name simply because they had no reliable information. In some 17th century maps, Tartaria reaches to the Pacific Ocean, brushing against China, and even the edges of Korea. In others, it shrinks, a narrow strip along the steppe, leaving the rest of Siberia blank or labelled with smaller, more specific tribal names. This elasticity gave Tartaria a ghostly quality, a place whose size seemed dictated more by imagination than reality. Scholars still debate whether these shifting borders represent ignorance or deliberate ambiguity. Was Tartaria truly an empire with a fluid, undefined boundary? Or was it merely a placeholder, a term used to describe what Europeans did not yet understand? Some argue that the name allowed mapmakers and chroniclers to impose a veneer of order on chaos, a convenient shorthand for hundreds of disparate peoples and polities. Others suggest that the elasticity itself may hint at a deeper truth, that Tartaria was never fully conquered or unified, existing more as a cultural and technological network than as a centralized state. The edges of Tartaria were not just geographic, they were political and cultural. The Russian Empire's expansion into Siberia, beginning in the late 16th century, brought many of these territories under centralized control. But even then, isolated tribes and semi-autonomous regions persisted, maintaining customs, architecture, and traditions that were occasionally mistaken by outsiders as Tartarian relics. In this way, the empire on the edges was not a static entity but a moving, living concept, defined as much by distance and mystery as by maps or conquest. Imagine travelling along the frozen rivers of Siberia in the 18th century. The horizon is a pale, unbroken white. Small settlements dot the landscape, but between them stretches vast emptiness. A traveller might see domed buildings in the distance, constructed with geometric precision that seems incongruous with the frontier. To him, these might belong to Tartaria, a name that conveys both awe and the unknown. The edges of the empire become a psychological boundary as much as a geographic one, marking the limits of knowledge and imagination. Tartaria's shifting boundaries also intersect with myth and legend. Some sources describe Tartarian influence reaching deep into China, Central Asia, even parts of Eastern Europe, suggesting a network of cities, trade routes, and fortified outposts that transcended modern notions of borders. Whether these accounts reflect actual historical networks or the exaggerations of travellers and cartographers, the idea of an empire on the edges endures. Scholars still debate the significance of Tartaria's fluidity. Was it a real political entity, or merely a conceptual space projected by those unfamiliar with the vast Eurasian interior? Perhaps it was both, a patchwork of people, cities, and technologies loosely connected under a name that captured Europe's imagination. In this sense, Tartaria was less a fixed place than an idea, an empire on the edges, stretching across geography, myth, and memory, resisting the tidy lines of maps and the certainties of history, Western chroniclers and Eastern silences. The story of Tartaria is as much about what is written as what remains unrecorded. Western chroniclers, European travellers, missionaries, and mapmakers filled pages with descriptions of Tartary, its people, its cities, its wealth and terror. Yet when we turn to the records from the lands themselves, the silence is striking. Local chronicles, Persian texts, Chinese annals, and Mongol court documents rarely mention Tartaria as a cohesive entity. This asymmetry fuels both historical inquiry and fringe speculation. Was Tartaria a European construct or a forgotten reality whose traces were deliberately erased? Mainstream historians explain much of this silence through geography and perspective. The Eurasian steppe was vast, difficult to traverse, and politically fragmented. Local records tended to focus on immediate polities, kanates, principalities, and tribal confederations, rather than the amorphous expanse Europeans labelled Tartary. Europeans, unfamiliar with the nuances, extrapolated a single empire from scattered reports, travellers' tales, and hearsay. In other words, Tartaria may have existed more as a European mental map than as a recognised political entity in its own lands. Yet the Western narratives are themselves fascinating. A 16th century French manuscript describes Tartary as a land of wonders and barbarities, where cities glitter and deserts rage, a kingdom without kings. Dutch geographers often added elaborate illustrations, horsemen with flowing banners, vast fortified cities, and rivers that vanished into icy wastelands. These accounts, while grounded in fragments of observation, were also heavily embroidered, blending factual reports with folklore. Some describe Tartarians with unusual physical traits, giants, pale-skinned warriors, or people with odd technological skill. While modern scholars dismiss such reports as exaggeration, they hint at how the idea of Tartaria became something greater than reality. A quirky example emerges in the writings of Jesuit missionaries to China. In their letters, they occasionally reference Tartary as a neighbouring region, often with vague borders and minimal detail. These mentions suggest awareness of its existence, but rarely any concrete information. For Europeans, the term was convenient. It conveyed the unknown, the exotic, the vast expanses beyond the reach of civilization. Scholars still debate whether this Western focus created a distorted image of the East. By centering the European lens, were chroniclers imposing coherence where none existed, or did they inadvertently preserve knowledge that local records suppressed, lost in wars, conquest, or the natural erosion of memory? After all, vast archives have been destroyed by fire, flood, and invasion, leaving gaps that invite speculation. Consider a hypothetical European merchant travelling along the Silk Road in the 17th century. He asks local guides about the lands to the north. They provide names of clans, rivers, and towns, but no overarching concept of empire. He returns home and combines these fragments with stories of Mongol horsemen, fantastical cities, and frozen steppes. In his mind, and eventually on his maps, Tartary emerges, a coherent, if imagined, realm. This interplay of knowledge and silence is key to Tartaria's enduring mystery. The West wrote what the East often left unrecorded or irrelevant. Travellers' tales, hearsay, and mapmakers' interpretations merge to form an empire more conceptual than administrative, more legend than polity. Scholars still debate whether Tartaria is better understood as a geographic placeholder, a European myth, or a trace of historical societies that have vanished under the sweep of time and conquest. In the gaps between chroniclers and locals, between maps and archives, Tartaria breathes. It occupies the spaces history cannot fully claim, existing in what is told, what is left unsaid, and in the imagination of those who yearn to fill the silence with stories of vanished glory. The empire becomes not only a place on a map, but a reflection of the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of wonder. The Romanov rewrite. As Tartaria's phantom lingered in maps and tales, the real world shifted. By the 17th century, the Russian Empire under the Romanovs began consolidating power across the vast expanses once loosely labelled Tartary. From Moscow to Siberia, a deliberate process of integration, colonization, and cultural standardization reshaped the landscape. In effect, the Romanovs rewrote the political map and, some argue, the memory of Tartaria itself. Mainstream history recognizes this as state-building in action. Following Ivan the Terrible's campaigns in the 16th century and the subsequent expansion of Russian influence eastward, vast territories were brought under centralized rule. Fortresses were constructed along rivers, cities were founded, and administrative systems imposed. Siberian khanates were absorbed, Tatar elites were co-opted or eliminated, and local customs were gradually assimilated into the Tsarist model. The process was gradual but transformative, turning a patchwork of autonomous regions into a coherent empire stretching from Europe to the Pacific. Yet the quirky element emerges in the way Tartaria seems to vanish simultaneously. Where once European maps depicted the expanse as a single entity, now labels shifted. Siberia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus replaced the term. Buildings with domes and ornate facades, sometimes older than the conquest itself, were renovated or repurposed, their original designers largely forgotten. Some enthusiasts interpret this as intentional erasure, The Romanovs, in consolidating power, systematically absorbed Tartarian identity into Russian orthodoxy, wiping away the cultural memory of a rival civilization. Scholars still debate the extent of deliberate erasure versus natural historical evolution. Was Tartaria a real polity actively suppressed by the Romanovs, or did the empire simply expand into regions that Europeans had loosely imagined as a separate entity? There is little doubt that Russian centralization rewrote the historical and geographic record. Census-taking, record-keeping, and the renaming of towns and rivers all contributed to a version of history that left Tartaria a shadow on the margins of memory. An intriguing, almost whimsical note lies in architecture. Cities like Tomsk and Irkutsk feature elaborate administrative buildings and houses with neoclassical facades, often attributed to Russian engineers. Yet some researchers note that these structures appear unusually advanced for frontier towns. Tartaria enthusiasts argue these were inherited from a prior civilization, repurposed by the Romanovs, evidence of a broader urban network that predated Moscow's authority. Historians typically counter that urban planning often leaps forward when empire demands demonstration of power, but the tension between explanation and speculation persists. Imagine a 17th century Russian cartographer updating an atlas. Tartary, once boldly marked across Siberia, shrinks to a note in the margins. Rivers, towns, and forts appear under new names, administered by the Tsar. Travellers passing through the steppe now encounter Russian governors rather than khans, Orthodox churches rather than mosques, Cyrillic inscriptions rather than lost scripts. Slowly, the old maps and old stories fade, leaving a continent claimed but its older memory uncertain. The Romanov rewrite highlights a recurring pattern in history. The consolidation of empire often coincides with the reshaping of memory. Territories are renamed, populations assimilated, and stories refashioned to suit new rulers. Tartaria's disappearance may thus reflect not an act of conspiracy, but the natural process by which empires assert authority over space and identity. Yet the mystery persists. Scholars still debate whether Tartaria's absence in later records is merely a result of standard historical evolution, or whether traces of a lost civilization survive in architecture, folklore, and rumour. And so, the ghost of Tartaria lingers in the gaps left by the Romanov consolidation, a reminder that empires may conquer land, but memory often resists complete erasure, world fairs and hidden hands. As the 18th and 19th centuries unfolded, the world seemed to celebrate progress with unprecedented grandeur. World fairs, expositions of technology, culture, and architecture emerged as stages to showcase human achievement. Paris, London, Chicago, and St. Petersburg hosted spectacles of innovation, revealing glass palaces, elaborate pavilions, and mechanical wonders. For some observers, these events highlighted not only modern ingenuity, but strange echoes of Tartaria, architecture and engineering that seemed too advanced or familiar to be wholly new. Mainstream historians emphasize that world fairs reflected industrialization, colonial expansion, and civic pride. The Crystal Palace of London in 1851, with its vast glass and iron construction, was a marvel of engineering. Similarly, the Exposition Universelle in Paris, 1889, celebrated modern electricity, elevators, and machinery that symbolized human mastery over materials and energy. These events were carefully documented, drawing on contemporary architects, engineers, and artisans, symbols of progress, not evidence of a vanished empire. Yet, fringe theorists argue otherwise. They point to ornate buildings in St. Petersburg and Moscow, constructed with elaborate domes, intricate masonry, and symmetrical layouts, claiming these are Tartarian structures misattributed to European designers. When viewed in photographs alongside expositions, some of these buildings seem to echo forgotten designs, suggesting that knowledge of Tartaria may have survived and influenced, or even been appropriated by, modern builders. The argument stretches to elaborate urban grids, star-shaped forts, and monumental civic structures, all interpreted as remnants of a hidden empire's aesthetic. A quirky example comes from the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The grandiose neoclassical pavilions, vast fountains, and precise symmetry astonished visitors. Modern observers note that some design elements bear uncanny resemblance to architecture in Russian and Central Asian cities previously attributed to Tartaria. Scholars point out this is likely a case of shared classical inspiration, but enthusiasts argue it reflects lingering Tartarian influence, subtly woven into global architectural trends. Scholars still debate whether Tartarian traces exist in modern expositions or urban design. Was Tartaria's architectural knowledge simply repurposed, or are we projecting patterns onto coincidental styles? Some historians suggest that rapid industrialization necessitated grandeur, and that international architectural vocabulary, neoclassical, Baroque, Beaux-Arts, naturally repeated motifs across continents. Others posit that the similarities are too precise to dismiss, suggesting a continuity of design lost to mainstream history. Imagine strolling through the Exposition Universelle in Paris. Iron frameworks glitter under gaslight. Palaces rise from the grounds with sweeping arches and domes. Visitors marvel at electric lights, fountains, and mechanized displays. Among the crowd, a sharp-eyed observer notices that some features, the arches, the domes, the symmetry, echo buildings half a world away, in Siberia and Central Asia, structures older than any modern engineer should recall. Was this deliberate, accidental, or simply imagination? The World Fairs reveal a tension between the known and the unknown, between recorded history and the possibility of hidden continuity. They demonstrate humanity's desire to awe, to impress, and to engineer marvels, but they also spark questions. If Tartaria once built cities of grandeur, might some of that knowledge survive, disguised in the monuments of modernity? Scholars still debate the answer, and for enthusiasts, the fairs are a stage where Tartaria's hidden hand might still be glimpsed, even if obscured by progress and historical attribution. In the interplay of exposition and conjecture, the ghost of Tartaria returns, not in maps, not in texts, but in stone and steel, in architectural echoes, in grand designs that hint at what was lost, hidden, or forgotten. It is a reminder that human history, even when documented, contains layers waiting to be rediscovered. The legend persists. By the early 20th century, Tartaria had faded from mainstream maps, its name mostly relegated to the annals of old atlases and dusty library shelves. Yet in folklore, photographs, and urban landscapes, the legend persisted, refusing to be entirely erased. While scholars emphasized the Mongol conquests, Russian expansion, and historical mislabeling as explanations, a quieter, more enigmatic narrative endured, one that suggested Tartaria was more than a phantom on paper, that perhaps fragments of its civilization survived in hidden or overlooked forms. Mainstream historians attribute the persistence of Tartarian lore to human fascination with mystery. Old maps, architectural curiosities, and inconsistent accounts create fertile ground for imagination. Tales of vanished cities, buried architecture, and strange technological feats are often reinforced by anecdotal observations. A half-buried building in Siberia, a neoclassical dome in a provincial town, or an unusually advanced urban plan. While these are typically explained through ordinary historical processes, urban growth, architectural borrowing, or stylistic flourishes, the narrative of Tartaria thrives on ambiguity, on the spaces between documented fact and human curiosity. One quirky strand of the legend involves photography. Early 19th century images of Russian, Siberian, and Central Asian cities show structures that appear disproportionately grand, with intricate ornamentation and geometric symmetry. Enthusiasts argue that these photographs reveal the remnants of Tartarian cities, partially buried or hidden by time. Mainstream scholars counter that the architectural styles reflect the influence of European design, Russian ambition, and regional adaptation. Yet the persistence of such images in popular imagination illustrates how evidence, even when mundane, can become mythic. Scholars still do. Abate the extent to which Tartaria's story is a product of historical misinterpretation versus genuine loss of knowledge. Some contend that the empire, as described in fringe accounts, never existed in the way enthusiasts imagine. Others suggest that Tartaria was a real, loosely connected network of people, cities, and technologies that history overlooked, only to be partially assimilated or destroyed during subsequent imperial expansions. Consider the tales that persist in folklore. In Siberian and Central Asian oral histories, there are references to enormous cities swallowed by flood or earth, to strange technologies and crafts beyond local comprehension, and to peoples with knowledge lost to memory. Some tales are clearly mythological, yet others hint at historical realities obscured by time. Travellers and chroniclers occasionally preserved fragments of these stories, adding them to maps or manuscripts that would circulate in Europe and beyond. Imagine a library in early 20th century Europe. A scholar pores over maps from the 16th and 17th centuries, tracing Tartary's borders as they shift and shrink. Nearby, photographs from Siberia show grand domes and ornate facades. The scholar knows these images belong to Russian cities built centuries earlier, yet a nagging question remains. Could there be more, something hidden beneath the layers of history and soil? The legend persists not only because of gaps in historical record, but because it resonates with human psychology. We are drawn to the idea of hidden knowledge, lost civilizations, and the mystery of what might have been. Tartaria functions as a canvas upon which history's uncertainties, architectural anomalies, and unexplained phenomena are projected. Scholars still debate whether the legend of Tartaria will ever be fully resolved. Is it a cautionary tale about the limits of European knowledge of the East, a testament to human fascination with grandeur and mystery, or a forgotten chapter of real history, partially buried by time and imperial ambition? The allure lies precisely in its ambiguity, an empire that exists at the intersection of fact, fiction, and imagination, waiting to be rediscovered in fragments and stories that endure across centuries. Maps that lie or tell truths. Maps are meant to guide, to measure, and to record. Yet in the case of Tartaria, maps themselves become enigmatic storytellers. From the 16th through the 19th centuries, European cartographers depicted the vast northern lands in ways that confound modern historians. Some maps show Tartaria stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific, encompassing mountains, rivers, and cities that are difficult to verify. Others shrink the empire to a narrow swath along the steppe, leaving the rest of Siberia blank. In both cases, the maps are as much imagination as geography. Mainstream scholarship explains this variance as a reflection of limited information. Travellers' tales, hearsay, and partial reports were all a cartographer had to work with. Legends of golden cities, vast armies, and strange peoples were integrated alongside more reliable geographic data. Some maps were even influenced by political agendas, exaggerating or omitting features to suit the ambitions of patrons, kings, or explorers. In this way, Tartaria became a flexible label, a placeholder for the unknown. A quirky feature emerges in the appearance of phantom cities and rivers. Some 17th century European maps depict great cities of Tartary, often labelled with names that disappear from later records. Rivers twist and turn in impossible loops. Mountains rise like theatrical backdrops, and boundaries fluctuate as if alive. These anomalies have fueled fringe theories suggesting that Tartaria was not only real but deliberately obscured. Advocates claim that the maps contain hidden truths about vanished cities, advanced technology, or empire-wide planning that was erased from conventional history. Scholars still debate the degree to which cartographers' errors reflect ignorance versus deliberate concealment. Were these misrepresentations simply the limits of exploration, or could they here, and at knowledge now lost? Some suggest that Tartaria's vastness, its sparse population, and the difficulty of surveying harsh terrain made accurate mapping impossible, leaving room for legend to fill the gaps. Others argue that anomalies on maps, such as strange urban layouts or rivers that defy logic, may indicate remnants of earlier civilizations or unrecognized historical networks. Consider a European geographer in the early 1600s poring over accounts from traders and missionaries. He must reconcile tales of palaces, star-shaped forts, and endless steppe with sketches of rivers and mountains that shift with each traveller's story. The result is a map that is part geography, part myth, part aspiration, an illustration not only of terrain but of imagination. To him, Tartaria exists both on paper and in the mind, a space where certainty dissolves into possibility. Maps also reflect cultural biases. European cartographers often placed their own perspective at the centre, distorting distant lands according to known reference points. Tartaria, at the periphery of the known world, becomes not a fixed empire, but a vast, ill-defined canvas. Modern researchers note that these maps are invaluable for understanding both historical knowledge and perception. They reveal more about European views of the East than about Tartaria itself. Yet the question persists, are some anomalies evidence of what historians have overlooked, or merely the inevitable result of incomplete data? Scholars still debate whether these maps contain coded truths, distorted histories, or simply the artistic license of mapmakers. For enthusiasts, each irregularity, every phantom city, is a breadcrumb, an invitation to wonder if a lost empire, vast and mysterious, once spanned the northern continents, hidden in plain sight, waiting for rediscovery. Artifacts and oddities. Beyond maps and architecture, Tartaria's allure survives in objects, curious artifacts that defy easy explanation, or at least appear to in the context of the empire's supposed scope. Coins, ceramics, intricate tools, and odd mechanical devices found across Eurasia are cited by enthusiasts as remnants of a civilization whose knowledge was erased or repurposed. Mainstream scholars usually interpret these items as the products of trade, conquest, or cultural diffusion, yet the anomalies spark persistent questions about the scope of Tartaria's influence. Mainstream historians trace much of the material culture of northern Eurasia to the practicalities of nomadic life and regional trade. Metalwork, for instance, shows remarkable sophistication, with patterned weaponry, jewellery, and horse tack stretching from Central Asia to Russia. These items were highly portable, durable, and sometimes ceremonial. Coins and trade goods further attest to an interconnected network of exchange, with silver and copper pieces moving along routes that predated modern borders. Such findings underscore the richness of steppe societies, even if they do not constitute evidence of a unified empire. Yet the quirky details are tantalizing. In Siberia, collectors have noted large, intricately carved stone blocks, some with geometric patterns that resemble modern architectural motifs, including arches and domes. Certain coins bear symbols that do not align neatly with known dynasties or khanates. Mechanical devices from Central Asia, watches, intricate locks, or water dispensing mechanisms appear far more complex than might be expected in frontier regions. These objects, while few and far between, feed the idea that Tartaria possessed both advanced technology and an aesthetic coherence that has otherwise vanished from historical records. Scholars still debate whether these artifacts indicate a distinct civilization or simply reflect diffusion of knowledge and stylistic conventions across empires. A single ornate lock, for example, may have been imported, gifted, or adapted locally, yet enthusiasts interpret it as evidence of systemic technology across the steppe. Coins with unfamiliar inscriptions could be localized minting or misread symbols, but they become proof in the eyes of those who envision Tartaria as a global network of innovation. Consider a Russian archaeologist in the 19th century excavating an old settlement along the Volga. They uncover stone foundations, fragments of tiled roofing, and metal objects engraved with geometric designs. The context suggests a typical trade settlement or provincial town. Yet, when viewed through the lens of Tartarian theory, these objects hint at something extraordinary. A lost empire whose technology, artistry, and urban planning survive only in scattered remnants overlooked by mainstream historians. The persistence of such artifacts underscores an important idea. Physical remnants, however fragmentary, provide a tangible connection to the past. Even when mainstream explanations suffice, the unusual or unexplained items fuel speculation and imagination. Scholars still debate the origins and significance of these oddities, acknowledging both the limitations of evidence and the human tendency to seek patterns where history leaves gaps. Tartaria, then, is preserved not only in maps, architecture, or chronicles, but in material culture scattered across Eurasia. Coins, tools, and construction fragments, sometimes mundane, sometimes remarkable, serve as silent witnesses to an empire that may have existed only partially in history and partially in legend. Each object prompts us to ask, are these merely remnants of known civilizations, or do they whisper of a more mysterious, lost network of knowledge and craftsmanship? Why Tartaria fascinates. The enduring fascination with Tartaria lies less in confirmed historical evidence and more in the human imagination, the space between recorded fact and possibility. For centuries, people have peered at maps, ruins, and photographs and asked, what if this vast northern land was once a real empire, now hidden beneath layers of conquest, rebuilding, and forgetfulness? The allure is universal. The idea of a lost civilization that challenges our assumptions about history, technology, and human capability. Mainstream scholars typically view Tartaria as a product of cartographic convention, mislabeling, and European misunderstanding of the Eurasian steppe. Nomadic tribes, khanates, and sprawling landscapes were simplified into a single concept for convenience and comprehension. Yet even as history explains away the anomalies, the legend persists. It thrives on the extraordinary. The domed architecture, the star forts, the odd artifacts, the half-buried buildings, all of which provide a tangible connection to the unknown. A quirky aspect of Tartarian fascination is the modern revival through digital media. Online forums, video essays, and amateur archaeology breathe new life into old maps, photographs, and architectural oddities. Enthusiasts compare buildings across continents, theorize about mud floods, and imagine lost technologies. What might once have been a niche curiosity has become a global phenomenon, demonstrating how legends evolve and persist even in the age of information. Scholars still debate why Tartaria captivates the imagination so strongly. Some suggest it functions as a cultural mirror, reflecting contemporary anxieties about forgotten knowledge, erasure, and the limits of historical authority. Others argue it satisfies a basic human desire for mystery, scale, and wonder, a way to grapple with the vastness of Eurasia and the fragment, airy nature of our historical record. Imagine standing today before a 19th century Russian building with ornate domes and intricate stonework. Its true history is documented, mundane, and explained in archives. Yet the eyes of a curious observer can see something more, the echo of a lost empire, a civilization whose full story may never be known, but whose presence is felt in every brick, arch, and dome. Tartaria exists in the tension between fact and speculation, between what was and what might have been. In the end, the story of Tartaria reminds us that history is never complete. Every map, artifact, and photograph is a fragment of human experience, susceptible to interpretation, embellishment, and imagination. The legend endures because it speaks to the thrill of discovery, the joy of speculation, and the eternal human yearning to uncover what has been hidden. Tartaria, whether real, imagined, or somewhere in between, continues to inspire wonder, inviting us to explore not just the steppe, but the limits of knowledge itself. Conclusion: Tartaria, as we have traced across centuries of maps, chronicles, architecture, and rumour, embodies the tension between recorded history and legend. It is at once a geographic label, a cultural phantom, and a repository for human curiosity. From Mongol conquests to Romanov consolidation, from star-shaped forts to grand domes and half-buried buildings, the traces of Tartaria, whether factual or imagined, challenge us to reconsider the boundaries of civilization. Its enduring presence in folklore, photographs, and modern speculation underscores a timeless truth: history is never fully complete. In the gaps, in the ambiguous corners of our knowledge, there is room for wonder, debate, and the possibility that the past holds more secrets than we dare imagine. Tartaria reminds us that even vanished or misinterpreted empires leave impressions, shaping maps, minds, and myths long after their supposed disappearance.